Jim, it's one of those days that I think we're just ready for this. I think we're ready for to go.
Yeah, and not only that, we have a really interesting topic to talk about today. It's one that, you know, if you've never been formally trained in project management, you really don't think of it as its own thing. But when you start thinking about it, you realize it's the most fundamental topic. It's like water for fish. We decided to talk about scope today. Now, let's go ahead and let me tell you a little story. For about 5 years before I got my credential, I was managing projects very successfully. But when I was managing, I wasn't thinking about scope. I was just doing a schedule, right? Here we are, and let's just build a schedule. I wasn't thinking about scope. I didn't even know what scope was. It was only when I was preparing for the PMP exam did I even think about it. Now let's realize what was happening. Okay, the scope is the deliverable and the work required to complete it. So I thought that when you're developing the schedule, that's what you're building. And so it took me almost 6 months of looking through and understanding, number one, oh, the deliverable and the requirements are over here and they define the work, and the schedule's over here. It defines the sequence. They're two totally different things. It was only when I started managing really big projects when I understand how critical it was to define scope.
Well, and not only that, and I remember distinctly, because we used to bid on a lot of very large projects that were fixed price, fixed fee, fixed schedule. Not only did you bid to what the scope was to define so that you can kind of put a boundary around the work that's to be done, but we also would often put in assumptions of what is not in scope so that we could contain it from that direction as well. So
yeah, it actually is the defining statement of the deliverable and nothing else, so that all the work of the project will be focused in one specific area. Create this thing, and when it's done, we're done. This is actually the discipline of the project.
Well, it's also where you win and where you lose. So, you know, I've been in situations where the client thinks that they can allow additional scope or they can ask for additional scope. And if you, the IT person, are nice, you'll kind of give it to them. What they don't realize, and what a lot of naive IT project managers don't realize, is that by doing these favors, and I think we'll talk about scope creep later on, but by doing these favors, we put the whole project in jeopardy.
Yes. With the established expectations, if you're going to change scope, everything else changes on it. It is the fundamental understanding. And so when you're starting to get into really critical projects, you have to have a firm understanding of, you know, the impact of changing any scope.
Yeah.
So this leads us to a really big question. How would you define scope if you were?
It's kind of like I attempted to mention, it's kind of the full body of work that you have been contracted to do as an IT project manager. And it can involve, obviously, the project itself in terms of the functional requirements, but it can go beyond that. Sometimes scope means the client, don't want to buy the equipment because your procurement processes are better. So we're going to have you buy the hardware as well as do the software. And so suddenly they add that to the scope. But you can't just add that to the scope without adding dollars, without adding people, without adding time. So to me, it's the full body of work to be done, but not just functional requirements put into a system.
Yes. And that's the key. It's it's actually connected directly to the requirements. Now, here's something to think about. There are work requirements and there's deliverable requirements. And so the scope has to talk about the work, it has to talk about the deliverable at the end of the project. And so you actually have to create a really crisp understanding in traditional project management of this is what we're going to have at the end. We call that product scope.
Yeah.
And here's the work we're going to do to build that thing at the end. And that's called the project scope. And those together are the total scope of the project. Now, we use that word scope very liberally. And sometimes when we say scope, the scope of the project includes 23 weeks of construction. Okay. The problem is we're talking 23 weeks. See, 23 weeks is getting into the schedule domain. And this is where things get, we get into minor details. But see, you need to know how and what for your scope. And that's, how is the work and what is the deliverable? But the schedule only puts a when to that work. That's the key. That's the key. How, what, and when.
So the scope being the how and the what, that's the body of work. And you're right, the methodology you're going to use to do it, all of that sort of thing. But the schedule puts it on a timeline. And I guess when you put the whole package together, in many ways, the schedule then can become part of the scope as well.
Well, actually, good practice is to group your work into these planning packages. And the planning packages can say, this is my construction work. This is my electrician's work. This is my plumber's work, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you can actually say, now you can say, okay, we've completed the scope of the plumbing. So you can actually, with your schedule, you can actually track not just completion of time, but you can actually track progress and completion of scope as well. I know it's really minor things. And some of the people listening says, there's no difference in that, Tim. And I'll say that there's a difference.
There is a difference. And in your case, the example you were just using, it's a big difference because in a construction project, the way that you're defining it, it's much more of a linear type of progression. So if the plumbers are late on their tasks, suddenly the drywall people come in to do the drywall, the plumbing is not finished, they're sitting around, you're paying for people who aren't there. Now, they eventually get to their scope of work, but now the schedule is suffering, and probably so is the budget. So
exactly,
it's a big deal.
Yeah, and not only that, let's think about this really carefully. This is one of those aha moments when you start realizing all the little dials and all the little measuring devices you have for understanding progress and project success.
And I was just thinking that I, like you in your early years, I was married to my schedule. As long as we can make that schedule, then we make the project. But by not paying attention to the body of work, our schedule would often slip because we would allow functionality to slip in. And so you're right, you have to watch. I think you used the word dial. You have to kind of turn every dial to make sure it all coalesces at the end with the end result. So yeah, that's why they pay us the big bucks, right, Tim?
Yeah. Here's the difference. Here's the difference of somebody who's been a project manager for 3 years and somebody who's been a project manager for 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
You're right. Somebody who's just starting out in project management, they're going to say, oh, we're behind. And somebody who has been doing this a while is able to basically overlay the scope and schedule analysis and say, here's why, and here's what we have to fix. And here's how we can actually improve if we're going to change things.
So have you ever been in a situation where someone said, oh, just build the schedule, we'll figure the scope out later?
Oh, yeah. Let's just start the work going. A lot of people.
That's a little cart before the horse, right?
Well, sort of. You know, that's something that we're all concerned about. We'll work the details out later.
Right.
Now, here's the strange thing. Agile, when you're first introduced to Agile, sounds like that. Oh, let's not work out the plan. Let's just have a high level plan, start the work, and then we'll work out the details. But actually, Agile, and we'll talk about this in future shows, is a very methodical, analytical process that delivers a high probability success when you have to face unknown situations that are complex.
Yeah, and I think your opening statement on that, where Agile seems like this, I think Agile seems like this in the beginning.
Yes.
But once you get your cadence, then things start to fall into place very quickly.
Isn't that wild? Yeah,
you can actually see functionality appear before your eyes as opposed to waiting for 2 years.
Yeah, it's really wild because that's exactly right. The Agile has that behavior of saying, you know, we know how people work together, and that's the secret. We know human behavior. We know group behavior. That's the secret. If we know that, then we know how to get people together to develop that high level framework without that details. And then we can use that early work in exploration and prototypes and experiments to quickly pull out the information. We can really quickly pivot to a true scope and schedule.
So I'm assuming that with your opening story that you probably learned the importance of developing scope fairly early on in your career?
Within 6 or 7 years. Actually, it was later in my career. It's earlier than some, but later than many. I didn't start off with the fundamental formal knowledge that some people do.
Again, the company I worked for, we used to bid those huge projects. So we learned very quickly that you can't really wrap a schedule around the body of work until you understand within some degree of certainty what that body of work looks like. And so we learned after a couple of bids that we won, but you don't win because you can't deliver. But we learned after a while that you work from the client's objectives first, and you start to kind of decompose those objectives into functional areas, functional pieces, whatever it is. Plus you bring in the hardware, you bring in maybe the conversion aspects, the data management aspects, all of that. And as you work through those objectives, it's then and only then that you can look at, okay, how do I put this on a timeline? Whether it's Agile or whether it's waterfall, how do I put this on the timeline and thereby bound my scope within that timeline? So yeah, it's a hard lesson to be learned sometimes, but you have to learn it.
Oh yeah. And that's the key. I woke up about 3 years into teaching project management, and it was like emblazoned on the inside of my head. It says, if you get your scope correct, the rest of your planning and project controlling is easy.
Yeah.
You get this down right and everything is fine. And in your world of fixed contracts, it's a necessity.
Oh, huge. And then you get the client that says, hey, I'm liking what you guys are doing. Can we shorten the schedule by 2 or 3 months just by throwing some bodies at it? Well, you know how that turns out.
Yeah, the result is bodies behind you being left. Exactly. I understand totally what that is. Yeah.
It was it the Mythical Man Month that talked about that?
Yeah, that was the introduction of the theory of constraints. That's right.
Yeah. That was what, 1970s or something?
It was, Brooks. And yeah. I think it came out in the early 1980s, early to somewhere between 82 and 84. And that's that, for those of you who don't know, this guy was the project manager of the operating system of the IBM 360 or 380, I think. And this was the early days of software development, wasn't it?
Yeah, probably is. what would I say, of structured software development.
I like
Because
that.
before that, it was kind of like a cowboy movie, you know, whereas everyone was a gunslinger.
Exactly, exactly. And it's funny because he came up with some really good ideas. One of them was, the theory of constraints, the triple constraint, or what we called the iron triangle.
Was it him that said that just because a woman can conceive and have a baby in 9 months doesn't mean that 9 women can do it in 1 month? Was that his?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what he was starting to figure out. Effort and duration seem to be proportional, but when it comes to certain types of work like software development, you have to leave that behind. There are many other considerations you have to have in place. And the considerations he was looking at were something called constraints or limiting factors. And he played with the limiting factors of scope, schedule, and cost, right?
Exactly. And to me, again, scope being the paramount part of that.
Yeah, scope is basically, we're looking at, I want it now, my schedule constraint. I want it cheap. That's my cost constraint, and I want it fancy. And that's my scope constraint, right? And the appropriate answer is yes, you can have 2, because the definition of 2 will redefine the third. The third is defined out of the results of the 2.
Yeah. And for people that don't get that, if I want it faster and cheaper, it won't be better. If I want it faster and better, it won't be cheaper. And if I want it better, and you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is what's really awesome. If you look at the progression of the project management body of knowledge, you can almost see people talking behind the scenes, because in one edition, they say, oh, here's the triple constraint. And then the next one, they say, oh, what about quality? Quality is a constraint too, so we have to have a square. And then all of a sudden, they say, no, quality is not just the only constraint beyond the 3. Everything and anything can be a constraint. So they had to build this whole class of methodology and terminology around constraints just from this simple triangle discussion. This constraining methodology is called, is called discipline. We need it.
So by now, okay, if I'm a young project manager listening to these 2 old geezers right now, my eyes are rolling in the back of the head. So, because there's a lot here and we've hardly touched on it, but how can I assure these young professionals that this just takes time, this takes effort in order to do this well? So it's not something that comes upon you, some blessing from on high. This is something you work at. So how much time would you think that you spend like developing scope?
So, okay. So if I'm talking about a 3-year construction project, it will probably be, I'm not talking about developing a plan.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about, we are going to have a data center in 3 years. And here's the great big pieces of work that we need to get done.
Yeah.
To get 50 to 75 people agree on that, it's going to take 1 to 3 months. You're going to have some chartering document that says, this is our data center. And then the first thing you do in these big projects is say, okay, let me get all the experts and all the leads together in a single room. And we're going to spend either a day or 2 or 4 days mapping this out into what we call a scope. We'll have a statement and we'll break that statement down into pieces. And by the end of that, we will have our scope baseline. But yeah, it can easily take 1 to 3 months.
Yeah, and my experience is more from a software development perspective. And so it's not a whole lot different. And I remember one of the last couple of very large projects that I was working with the client side to help them set up their scope, to be able to put the scope of work into an RFP to send out to system integrators to bid on. I probably spent the same thing, about 3 months with a body of about 20 staff, going through meticulously to just, and when I say meticulously, I'm not even talking details. I'm just talking major functional areas and how they relate to each other, so that we could put a comprehensive, cohesive grouping of functional items into an RFP for people to bid on. It took about 3 months. And then when the system integrator that was successful with the bid came on, we spent another 6 months decomposing those functional requirements into their basic elements. So it's not a light task, but for our young project managers, the importance is it takes work, it takes effort, and make sure your schedule accommodates that additional work.
And I would actually advise people who've never done this before, if you really have an opportunity to sit in on these scoping workshops, sit in that room and take notes. Don't say anything. Just listen to how, how they're going back and forth and debating and looking at the information and the opinions. It's a wonderful process to observe.
So in the Agile, we talked about Agile earlier, based on what I had just talked about, where we defined sort of the big bulky pieces of what has to be done. So the Agile process, in my mind, becomes the decomposing of those big functional areas into epics and features and user stories.
Yeah, actually what happens is, and this is getting interesting, because the business, your executives and your decision makers and the product owner, they say, okay, in order for us to set aside millions of dollars to release this new product, we're going to want to release it in these phases, right? And these are called release cycles. And basically, that's going to be your strategy or your roadmap. And your job is to put together people who are comfortable and knowledgeable in doing this and figuring out, okay, we really don't know what these pieces are, but can we actually break them into logical components that we can start working on and use the early work to define the requirements from this?
Yeah. Which become your functional scope. It all kind of comes together, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's again, they're just two different methodologies, just two different ways of doing work. And we've always gone under the assumption that all work needs these hard requirements at the beginning. Well, sometimes that's impossible. And that impossible time is why Agile was created.
Yeah. So for two respected gray-haired project managers like us, we've probably never ever experienced scope creep, have we?
I've only experienced it on each and every project.
Yeah.
What do you call scope creep?
To me, it's doing anything outside of the contracted body of work.
Very good.
Or in some cases, even if it's reducing the body of work, so now you're kind of imploding as opposed to exploding. But even that's a change in scope. So yeah, it's all scope creep, though. Typically, you think of as extending your scope and adding more work to the project.
Yeah, actually, if you look into the details, it's called unapproved change.
Yes, unapproved.
That's where it has not gone through formal change control. Yeah. One of the major disciplines you have, it doesn't matter which methodology you choose, is that change will be formal. Change will be formal. So when a team member comes to you and says, "Hey, I have a great idea for shortening this work this week," and the proper response of a project manager says, "Great. What about the quality? What about the cost? What about the resources? What about the risk? Give me those data and let's talk about this."
So where I've typically experienced this on projects is, I believe very strongly in co-locating my project resources with the client's project resources.
Oh yeah.
And the best compliment I've ever had was when someone finished a project audit and came out and said, "By the way, who did I interview that's from the project side and who did I interview from the client side?" That's when you get that team that works together so well. That's considered great cohesive project work. However, here's the danger. they like each other so much that the client side says, you know what? If I just had these 2 extra reports, it would make my job work so much easier. And the programmer or the developer who has developed a strong relationship with this person said, oh, that's easy. I can slip it in the next couple of weeks. We'll just get that done for you. And it doesn't ever elevate to the project manager to get any kind of formal scope.
Yeah, and see, this is where, you know, I have a lot of my students in my classes saying team charter. That's not for the stakeholders, that's for the team. And I say, I beg you to reconsider this because you should have one set of rules.
Yeah.
And even if the stakeholders don't have that interaction with the team or the relationship, they should understand how, you know, how strictly and with what level of discipline we manage that scope.
Well, and how do you identify? You know, I've talked about something that kind of happened surreptitiously, not maliciously, but surreptitiously. I'm doing you a favor, you know, under the covers kind of thing. So how do you eventually figure out that there has been scope creep if you're the project manager?
Oh boy. There's about 12 factors. Let's start off with the obvious ones. Okay. Your schedule has changed. Your progress on the work has changed. What causes? Now, that could be 1,000 different factors, right? And so you're going to have to do root cause analysis. Second of all, communication channels. Who's talking to whom? Where are those little pools of knowledge being isolated? Where are those pools of knowledge traveling? Because wherever information travels, new ideas travel. And, you know, just from a lessons learned standpoint, understanding your communication channels is really a necessity if you want to pick up these little tiny nuggets of knowledge.
Yeah.
This is a fun activity for me. How do I actually find these hidden communication channels? I'd like to have a conversation in the future on that.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good one. The example that I used where my team and the client team became buddy and worked so well together. That to a project manager, you know, you walk around just kind of proud of the fact that you've got this closely knit team, but you have to become aware of the dangers of what that also got as an example. So, and this is the part that I try to get across to budding project managers is that it's not just Gantt chart and schedules and all that. It's all of these other nuances that you learn from experience to watch out for.
Yeah. Oh boy. Let's park scope creep for a little bit. Let's talk about another danger to our project, gold plating. Do you ever have unnecessary change in scope?
Yes. So much like the scope creep conversation we just had. Yeah, I've had developers who have decided to go above and beyond to help their client out, to give them perhaps a nicer user UI or something like that, and actually derail. In fact, let me that reminds me of a story. One of my very first huge statewide projects that I worked on, we finished user acceptance test. We were about to go live on a Monday morning. On a Sunday night, my senior developer, who was in charge of getting everything ready to go the next day, decided that he had never liked the menu structure. And so he worked all night in cleaning up what he called cleaning up the menu structure to make it look more usable, user-friendly, whatever it was. And the next day, as the ceremony starts, we're going live, you press the button and nothing happened. So he was gold plating something that had been working in user acceptance testing and was working just fine, decided to tweak it. Well, more than just tweak it, decided to gold plate it is what he did. And it basically stalled our entire implementation. Talk about egg on my face.
See, this is both gold plating and scope creep.
Yep.
The combination of both of those together is exponential, not just linear in impact.
Yeah. But
Wow.
so yeah, I guess the example I used before where someone had developed an extra two reports, that would be scope creep, not really gold plating anything. But yeah, there are times when people throw in where something is working just fine. They decide to throw in something that makes it just prettier.
Well, and again, that you're talking about functionality here, but in the world of contracts, it's just as dangerous to have gold plating because it's not part of the commitment. But number two, you're basically breaking your original commitment by going beyond scope because you're delivering something that they haven't agreed to.
No, that's exactly right. And
Yes.
even if they think they're getting a good deal, it's not a good deal if it's putting your project at jeopardy.
And in that case, it can be an approved change, and yet it's still gold plating. This is where understanding your scope boundaries. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're not going to do. And then understanding we have a baseline of boundaries and we're not going to change those without formal change. So an understanding and management of both gold plating and scope creep is critical.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So based on that, let's take a look at developing scope, say in just a protracted time frame, maybe even in a single meeting. How would we go about setting up just an agenda or a flow of work for that meeting?
Okay. So let's plan a meeting for developing a scope. At the end of this meeting, we're going to have a scope baseline, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to need experts, team members, potential team members, maybe key decision makers, right?
Yeah.
We're going to need some high level understanding of the deliverable and objective. Let's call that the project charter. And then what we're going to have to do is have that approved in that meeting. Say, this is what we're going to do, and this is all we're going to do. Let's say yes on this together, and then we can move forward.
So in that case, especially if you're you would have to develop it with the client base. So even if the main sponsor did not want to be part of that meeting, you should always insist on the fact that that main sponsor would send their primary stakeholders, whether it's their deputies or whatever, so that they can, because those people kind of have the bigger vision than even the subject matter experts that you may bring on. They have the vision, the subject matter experts have the expertise in how the work is being done and what would be nice in the to-be, in the final system implementation. So having those two bodies represented well in your scope of work detailing exercise, I think, is paramount.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then I think what we can do is say, okay, does everybody in the room know what we mean by this big piece of work? No. Okay, who's an expert here? Who can actually describe it? And get them up and give them the floor to actually define that piece of work, and then make sure that everybody in the room understands what each big work item is in that scope statement.
No, and to solidify that, you would end up with a written up statement of work or a statement of scope and get that signed off right there with everyone agreeing at that point.
Yes, what we are going to do, what we won't go to do. And that way, when everybody leaves the room, especially if everybody's assigned to a work item, they understand the big picture and they understand how each work item impacts their work. And they also understand how their work item impacts each other work. You get that consensus.
Yeah.
You get that group understanding, not just an individual understanding.
And then you pray like everything to make sure that those people who've come to that understanding stay on with you as the project gets delivered.
Well, so what you want to do is, now that you have your scope baseline like that, you can actually break up those small, the lowest level detail, the most precisely defined small components of that scope, and hand them off to the experts. And then you can tell your experts, okay, put a schedule around this, give me the resources, give me the risks, give me the budget for this piece. And then all you have to do is get the leads or get the team back together if you want. And then you get to stitch it all together. And that is how you build your project management plan.
Yeah, exactly. Now you've got scope and schedule.
Yeah, and budget and
budget,
resources and
yeah.
risk. And your experts are doing it for you.
So I think we're actually have covered this topic fairly well, but I want to talk about one more aspect of it. And that is, have you ever been in a position where someone changed the scope on a project? And I'm not talking scope creep or gold plating. I'm talking a purposeful change in scope on a project that's ongoing.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. The most radical change in scope, 9/11. That was wicked. We had to say this scope is now irrelevant. We had when I was working as a consultant, we had 3 projects ongoing in one of the basements of the building in New York. And we couldn't find 2 of the team members for 4 days.
Oh,
we didn't know that the cell towers had been knocked out, and other cell towers have been controlled by the government and by the police. And so our projects said, no more scope, we're replanning. And what we're going to do is basically how can we redefine this project to find our team members?
I think my worst example, and I shouldn't say worst, my most complex example of this was when we were developing a very large project for a state government entity. And it was in the health and welfare arena, what we call public human services applications. And right in the middle of us doing that, we were literally finished our requirements. We were into the design and some aspects were being developed. Some people who are listening to us from other countries may not realize this, but it's the Affordable Care Act was passed. People may have heard of it called Obamacare. It happened under President Obama's administration. When the Affordable Care Act was passed, it changed a lot of the rules that we had already analyzed, designed, and were already programming. And so talk about having to kind of retreat. We basically had to put on a work stoppage, try to read the act, try to understand what was happening once the rules were promulgated, and see what was affecting not only what had already been done, but what was new. And so just that scoping exercise of a major change like that took probably a couple months, where we had to keep our entire project staff busy while we worked this out. So that was the other challenge. How do you do a work stoppage and yet keep your project busy so that you don't lose valuable staff even while you figure this out? That was, yeah, it happens. Change orders happen.
Yeah. And we have to take our time, even if it is work stoppage. We have to take our time and understand the impact of these changes to the project. And like we said earlier, it's not just changes in scope. It's changes in scope which impact schedule, quality, risk, and everything else.
Yeah. Now it's entirely possible that you're going along. Let's say I bid a fixed price project, and in doing the calculations with the client, let's say we have to produce 75 reports. And as we're moving along in the requirements, we realize that we probably could use 5 or 6 more. That's a change request that you can absorb with a little extra time, a little change in schedule, maybe bring on another resource, a little extra money into the budget. Those kind of changes are much more easy to develop than changes that upend your entire project, like Obamacare or like 9/11.
Well, and here's the wicked thing. This is why Agile exists. It's to actually get those little pieces of tacit knowledge exposed so you can use them into making a better outcome.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll tell you, having I've always said this, and you'll laugh at this, but you know, in the days when we used to do these large mammoth bids, my wish as the project delivery person, my wish was always that the person who sold the business should be part of delivering the business.
Oh, certainly. Oh, certainly. You know,
Some of the promises that are made in the proposal is like, we said that.
it's just like having the team create the schedule, you know, it's their ideas, so they should be able to commit to the work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in closing all this out, what would be, you know, what would be your, if you had to say just one statement about scope and its role in projects to somebody, what would you say?
I would say this, and I'm talking now delivering the project. What I used to tell my teams, and what I still do, is that you need to understand the scope of work as well as or better than our client. You need to understand their rules and their business process as well or better than they do. And it's only that, and you need to learn their language. Don't require them to learn your language. And in doing so, we have a much better chance of maintaining scope, because if you don't know the scope intimately, it's much easier to kind of go off the rails with a change here and a change there. So to me, that's the number one thing: know scope intimately as well or better than your own client.
Very good. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I would only add in a secondary voice, if you can focus on scope and get your scope down early, the rest of your planning and controlling of the project is going to be fairly simple, because that gives you your defining structure for both the work and the deliverable.
Absolutely. That's absolutely critical.
Okay. I think we've done well in our conversation today, Merv.
Did we stay within the scope of this podcast?
We certainly did. We
All
certainly
right.
did. So if we the public want to talk to you throughout next week, where can we find you?
The best, it's like we say every week, right? The best place is LinkedIn, because that's where ideas are shared most. Well, LinkedIn is a platform for sharing ideas, and that's where I like to share ideas.
Yeah, and myself as well. It's probably the best way to reach me if we don't have direct contact right now.
Very good.
Okay.
All right. I think we are fine for now until next week.
Thanks again. I appreciate your conversation, and thanks everyone for checking in on us this week.
All right. We'll see you.